Hey everybody, and welcome back to our scenario playthrough series. This is part number 2 of our Rainbow Valley playthrough, where we cannot modify the landscape or remove any trees. Last episode we built 4 coasters on our way to 1,000 guests by the end of October year 4. Right now we are getting ready to build coaster number 5. Suspended coaster is kind of an interesting one because you've got the 3 height clearance, and typically it ends up being kind of a wider coaster that takes up a little bit more space, just with some of the larger corners and things. And it's a little bit sprawling, but when I was kind of planning for this build, I was talking with Andrew from Mickey Man's RCT station, and he showed me a screenshot from his playthrough on this map, which you can find on his channel. And he did a really nice suspended coaster kind of up above the trees, sort of meandering up there. Once you get above the trees, it's actually not too hard to fit something like this in. So I thought, maybe it's worth a shot, and he had some suggestions for me, and between his suggestions and kind of my screwing around with it a little bit, I ended up with a layout that I liked well enough to continue. So you can see kind of what we're starting with here. Again, lift going up through kind of the one straight section that we've got, and then having to do a little bit of kind of weird shaping on some things just to get it to fit, like that kind of flat bit before our big drop. But I don't think it's out of the question from a realism standpoint. And then we have our nice big drop over the water, kind of a la Big Bad Wolf, I suppose. And then we're going to do some of these, or a big sweeping corner like this, and then the rest of it's going to be just kind of a bunch of corners that are going to get this thing to swing around. This pathway that I've got in here is more or less temporary, and you can see right now I'm actually adjusting it to go a different way. We're going to move this at least one more time after this. I can't recall if it's more than that or not, but at this point, a lot of the pathways here are sort of a placeholder to get the peeps where we need to get them, and then after that, it's really just getting the rides in place, and then we can fit the pathway in afterwards, since the pathway has more flexibility than the rides do. So you can see here we've got kind of our midpoint of the ride here, where we're kind of weaving it through the trees a little bit right down on the ground, which actually I kind of think would be a neat experience from a rider perspective. But again, our pathway is right in the way, so we're going to clear out this section once again. And sort of annoyingly, when you have the guests in there, you can't immediately remove the things without having to deal with a bunch of guests to pick up and move about. So I use the no entry sign to at least get most of the guests out of the way, not all of them, because that's just a little bit of a managerial issue, but now they're all gone, so we can continue along. I said at the beginning of last stream that my goal was to avoid building right over top of the water, and so far we've more or less done that. We've crossed the water, but we haven't necessarily built over top of the water. The suspended coaster is going to kind of go against that just a little bit, but the reason I kind of feel okay about that one is because in the suspended position, you're kind of hanging above the water, so it kind of feels like you're less in the water and more kind of flying over top of it. So I feel a little bit better about putting this kind of a ride over top. We're going to still not do too much over top of it, but at least I wanted to balance that a little bit, I suppose, since ideally, and really ideally, you're not putting flat rides over top of it or something where you have a big platform that's just going to hide the water in general. I think the biggest thing for me is the obscuring of the look of the water and being able to kind of follow the river with your eyes as you go down through the whole thing. So I think this one works out okay. So here we are, a little bit of an awkward finish, and we're actually going to modify it one more time here. Not necessarily sure if the modification made it better or worse, but I think it's not too bad here. A couple more straight sections than I might have liked, but in general it works fairly well. We also get ourselves a nice long brake run, which is appropriate for this. The only downside so far is that we have a 4-car train, which is way shorter than typical. Now, granted, these suspended coaster trains in RCT are fairly large compared to a lot of the other trains in the game. I don't know if that means that the scale is wrong necessarily, but they're really big, kind of like the corkscrew trains, I suppose. But in the end, we're going to make the best of it. We're going to use 4 trains, and that's okay. So, or 4 car trains. We'll use 2 of those, and so it's not too bad. The capacity is not huge. We don't need the capacity at this stage. We just need the guests. So we need to be able to get that soft guest gap up so we can get the rest of the way. So there's our modification that we made to the coaster as well. That lets us get the exit pathway underneath. And then we're going to cross separately for the entrance, which I'm going to stick up here. Kind of an odd little spur of pathway that we never really resolve in our build. We'll do a little bit of adjustment at the very, very tail end. I think it's honestly the last thing that we touch to try and make that make a little bit more sense. But in the end, it was something that I just couldn't quite figure out. And here too, trying to connect across a pathway to the exit path, because ideally you don't want your exit path to dump your guest somewhere just totally far off to the other side of the park, and that's kind of what it's doing right now. So we will figure out a way to connect that later towards the end, but for right now we're just going to put some fencing in there and call it a day. So with that, we have 5 out of 5 coasters. Now, in my test build, I did actually have a Vekoma Junior Boomerang through here, which is a fairly easy one to do as long as you have enough straight section for a lift and a station. It kind of went perpendicular to where the suspended coaster station was. I kind of kicked around the idea of sticking it in there as well, so we'd have 6 coasters, but in the end it just didn't quite fit, and the layout looked a little bit forced, so I didn't want to go too far on that. So now we end up with what may be the most challenging ride that we encounter in this whole build, which is kind of funny considering that the coasters went in relatively easy. Granted, that's from a bit of practice ahead of time, but this car ride that I'm building kind of just as a spur of the moment, trying to use some of these vertical faces here, ended up being just an absolute pain in the butt. Why was it a pain in the butt? It was a pain in the butt because of clearances, namely that suspended coaster. I said earlier it's got the 3 height clearance, and we just couldn't get underneath of the helix. And so we're trying a couple of different things here with a station up top, a station down below, and just trying to figure out how to not only cross underneath so we can make this thing a full circuit, but then also get our exit and our entry path in there. So we tried a half underground, half overground station, and got the connection across very easily like that. But now we can't get underneath. We can get underneath here because we can't modify the landscaping. There's no way for us to level out that track and then make a turn. So unfortunately, we are kind of stuck here, and I get into some of these challenges, I think, when I think that something can fit, and it sure looks like, if you're just looking at this, it looks like surely there must be a way to make this fit. I find that sometimes I just kind of build like I'm hitting my head against a wall and just do it over and over and over again, just try the same couple of things even though it just doesn't want to work. Sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes it actually goes okay. Actually, here I'm trying to modify the suspended coaster to see if we can even fit it in place and get it out of the way. So I saved the map there just so in case this didn't work out we can just easily revert back to it. So I tried to do a little bit of modification here to make the thing fit a bit, and we were 1 shy there of the S-bend that we needed. So in the end I didn't really want to sacrifice the overall look of the coaster just for a car ride. So this one was an idea that went out the window, unfortunately. And you can see here, even a little bit of modification, it still just doesn't do anything for us. So again, kind of like hitting your head against a wall to some extent, and it would be so much easier and not an issue even remotely if we could modify the land, but we can't. So we're going to take a break, and sometimes that's the best thing that you can do. If you just can't figure it out, sometimes you gotta just go do something else and come back to it. And we will come back to it a little bit later. But for now, we're going to work on connecting up the little flat ride area that's at the top of the mountain behind the wooden coaster. And we're going to connect that with another pathway here so we can have a loop of path. Because typically, as we've talked about before, my preference, whenever possible, is to have a loop of path rather than a linear path. Just makes peep wayfinding way easier. Eventually you're all going to get there to where you're going, whether you go the left or the right way. If it's a loop, you're going to get there in some fashion or another eventually. So we are going over this other little mountain here, and it gives us an opportunity to drop our observation tower in its new home. We can get rid of the temporary one that we had and then kind of connect across over here to the shot tower. We end up with a little tiny queue there for the shot tower, but we'll eventually get that fixed up and swap the entrance and exit to something that makes a little more sense. While we're doing viewing type things on here, we'll add to the observation tower a Ferris wheel so we can complement that fit. I think that one works okay. And then we'll use some of the fencing here to obscure a little bit of the stilts that all the rides are sitting up on and some of the pathways. So the solid ones just kind of make it look a little better, I think, in general. On this one, ideally, all those pathways would be sitting down on the ground, but because of the lack of ability to modify the landscaping, we just have to kind of deal with it and make the most of it as best as we can. So now, I think this is going to be our last tracked ride. We are going to fill a log flume into this space. We kind of had this other hill just not really used, and it kind of made sense to try and use some of this water on the side to build ourselves a flume. So we are going to kind of wind this one through here a little bit. Theoretically, this shouldn't be too difficult because we don't have large corners, you don't have diagonals, you don't have any of that kind of stuff. So we really just have to avoid the couple of trees and have enough space that we can have some drops and some lifts on straight sections. You can see I'm using a second flume right here to try and build in this kind of lower half, because the idea was maybe it kind of ends up being stacked. We use the vertical faces down below, have some kind of tunnel interactive elements, and then come up to the second level, and then we go up to the top section before we have our big drop. So that's the idea and kind of what's driving this look at this point. So here we connect it across, and then we have a fully connected flume here. So now we can eventually swap out those two rides and make it work a little bit. Looking at potentially moving the pathway there, but didn't end up working out. So now we have some random pieces of path up there that we'll eventually have to remember to remove. But here we go to a drop, and using this vertical face down here, we can do a little bit of kind of windy pathway, or flume pathway anyway, through here. We're going to use the river itself as our retention pond, and that's not uncommon for older flumes to actually just draw straight from some water source that they're nearby and fill up the flume in that way. So we're going to do that, and it also kind of gives us the ability to throw this over top of the water, kind of in a similar way to the suspended coaster. This one feels a little more appropriate for going over top of the water just because it's a water ride, and if we're using the river as the retention, then any splashing and everything else just automatically goes straight to the retention, so we don't have too much loss there. We'll save those peeps from drowning as we remove our giant ugly walkway there. We did find a way to do some underground pathway there and work our way up. I don't love huge underground sections of path, but in this instance it really cleaned up the space a little bit. So now we've got a great complete circuit, but no station, because I was just trying to get the thing done, and then once we got it wrapped up in a layout that kind of flowed through there, I realized, oh, we don't have a station. So now trying to figure out where we can get enough straight section that we can put in a station, also an exit, also an entrance, also a queue, also an exit path. All those things kind of adding together make it more complicated, so it's not just the try and find a way to fill the track in there, but try and find a way to not only fill the track, but also get all of the ancillary stuff that you need to make it work. So here we are, and the only thing keeping us from finishing it now is the suspended coaster that we just had to make a little adjustment to there, and we can do that, and now we have a complete circuit. So there is our flume done, so we can put in our entrance and our exit, and because we got rid of that path here a little while ago, we can now put our exit path right there at the drop for the corkscrew coaster, which would actually be a pretty cool interactive element there, right, standing kind of right by the fastest bit on that coaster. So that's kind of a fun one. Now we'll drop our pathway through here so we can get our queue across the water and over to the path, and finish off with some hedges. So that worked pretty well, I think, and ended up cleaning up the space a bit and gets a Flume in there, which I always did want to do through here as well. We did have I think we had the option anyway for a Rapids, although I chose not to do one just because I tend to like to sink the Rapids rides into the ground, and since we can't modify here, I was kind of fearful that it would just look ugly because I didn't think we could keep it close enough to the ground that we could just hide things with bushes or fencing or other things like that. And while we're on it, I really didn't do a lot of bushes in this map. Ideally, we could have come back and done a full overlay of landscaping in general and kind of come through. I think my brain for this map was really just on you can't add trees, because the minute you add a tree, you can't remove it. So I really didn't add any landscaping, so aside from fencing, I guess. So we could really come back and do quite a lot of bushes and other trees once we get everything put in and all of that. But for now, we're going to continue to just rely more heavily on the fences. Here's a final thrill ride that we got for ourselves. We get the swinging inverter ship, because we are getting closer to the goal, and we are into year 4 now. We still need those 1,000 guests. 5 coasters should be more than enough to get the guests through the gate, and it will be, spoiler alert, but just a matter of getting there in the meantime. But I am going to go through and start to add some little food stalls and things throughout, and also some of the info kiosk and some other stuff, just because we haven't really done a whole lot of that so far, and you kind of can neglect that fairly easily, and those do contribute to not only peep happiness, but your guest gap as well. So we're going to kind of start to go through and add in some of these little eating areas and seating areas. So like this one right here that overlooks the wooden coaster, put a restroom in the back there and a burger bar and some seats there on at the end. A lot of this I've really learned from Andrew at McMahon's RCT station, where we can have these sort of dead end zones that have the 3 benches on the end. I would have never really done that before. It was not really kind of my thing. I was always more of if it's a path, it needs to be continuous, and you don't want dead end paths ever, ever, ever. But that's not necessarily true, and little spur things like that can actually be fairly useful for just making a place setting feel a little bit nicer and just making the whole thing work out in a slightly cleaner way. So here we are now fixing up our shot tower. We're going to just replace it and drop in a queue and reverse where the entrance hut is and the exit hut is. So we'll do that and clean up that whole thing. And there we are. So now we have that in place. We also went through and started to repaint some of these rides into more of a neutral color scheme, because I guess the thought process would be, if this park is not allowing you to modify the landscape or remove any of the trees, I guess that means they care about the environment. Clearly not enough to prohibit you from dumping a bunch of roller coasters in here, but we're going to go for that sort of muted color tone ride on those to blend it in just a little bit. So now that we've done all of that, it is time to return to the car ride. So the best way to do this in some of these instances is just to start from scratch. So we're going to do that and delete the whole thing, including that pathway that we put across. So that way we have a fresh set of eyes and a fresh slate to go forward with. So what we're going to do now is try something a little bit different and put in our station just right here. This lets us turn into the vertical face right there instead of trying to go underneath of that suspended coaster helix. So we can do a short indoor section or underground section, and then kind of come back out, go back in again, and then go up the hillside and get ourselves a nice little layout. This also lets us circle around there and kind of go up the hill and connect up on this side. So now we actually have a ride that is complete. So that's not too bad and ends up looking kind of okay in the end. Now we can drop in an entrance and an exit. We're going to put a bridge for the entrance and a bridge for the exit, both in there at once. We're going to use the sports cars since those seat 2 across, so our capacity is slightly better than the racing cars, even though typically I'd always like to see the racing cars, but in this instance, the sports cars are the winner. We're going to go through and paint all those rainbow colors as well, just to keep with the theme. And what would a car ride be without a whole bunch of fencing? So we will do all that and toss it through here. We've done a bunch of hedges throughout the rest of the map. Just I tend to like those anyway because they're green and solid and kind of do a nice job filling in some of the gaps between things. So hedges, kind of the real MVP of fencing in this instance. So at this point, we are over the goal and about halfway through year 4, so it's just a matter of trying to close out our victory here and finish up with a slightly cleaner map. And that's kind of been the goal here throughout the rest of this, is just to kind of clean up the space and make it look a little bit nicer, fix up some of our pathways, because really our pathways have been sort of all over the place, just trying to connect A to B and do it in the most efficient way possible. But now I'm just trying to get some of these more close to the ground so we don't have to deal quite as much with those pathways that are just really high up off the ground and just look kind of stupid. So we have a little bit of that, but not quite as much, and it's also hidden by some of those trees, so that works out fairly well. And we have just enough space in here that we can squeeze a little spiral slide as well. So that fits in there quite nicely, and I think that might be the last ride of our scenario, but we still have a little bit to go in terms of fencing, in terms of food and drink stalls, and just kind of general cleaning up the space and trying to make it look slightly more intentional. So we have a lot of fencing to do and squeeze in here, and then just pathway modifications to fix it up and try and clean up a little bit. We have the vertical face right there, and because the entrance or the restroom and the souvenir stall are only too high, we can sink that underground quite easily. So that works fairly well. I'm going to change these flat rides to that more muted color scheme, and think that looks alright. And now targeting over here to this pathway, where I found it's actually easier to raise the thing up a little bit and go alongside the wooden coaster there, kind of almost on a shared bridge, to clean that whole section up just a bit. I briefly explored a sky ride in here, but because we don't put corners on our chairlifts, just because that's not super realistic in the sense of these types of rides or this specific type of chairlift in the game, we are going to avoid that. But we will not avoid trying to fix up the entrance and exit for the dive coaster here, which have been kind of there from pretty much the very beginning, and we're never in a really great spot. It just never looked amazing to begin with, so we're going to try and clean that up a little bit. Granted, there's not a ton you can do, so it still is pretty high up off the ground, and there's not a whole lot available, but by cleaning this up just ever so slightly, we can make a walkway that looks maybe a little bit better, kind of stacked in that way, so it gets the vertical height without spreading too far horizontally. And that's kind of the goal in general here, is just don't take up a ton of space with that if possible, make it look relatively efficient. And now, because we have all of the rides in, I can put some trees in there, feeling confident enough that I'm not going to have to go back and try and put something there when I now cannot delete the trees. So it's okay at this point. I feel like it's a bit of free-for-all. And here we go. I said at the very beginning that this last section by the coaster station was sort of a bit of a thorn on our side, so we're going to take care of that in a minute. But first, we had unlocked mine scenery, so we'll drop in some of the various little theming elements there. That said, because we can't change the texture of the ground, we can't get our dirt and grass or our dirt or our rock or any of that, so it just kind of looks a little bit silly sitting there in the grass. But that's okay. It's not like we can do much about it, so we will continue as is. So a little bit of a modification there to our pathway. It lets us put a drink stall and a food stall out here. Not exactly the most convenient, but a nice little scenic spot if you want to watch the Flume. But with that and a couple of fences, we are wrapped up with this scenario. So Not too bad. We are going to win here in just a minute, and we will move on to the real-time section. So let's jump over to that, and let's take a tour of the park. And here we have our completed Rainbow Valley Park. I think we did pretty well here. Got 5 big coasters squeezed into this space, and I think they turned out pretty alright. Nearly 1,300 guests as well, so not too bad for a goal. Our goal was 1,000, if you recall. So here we are into the park. We'll just start here at the entrance where we have our big dive coaster kind of looming over that front bit. High, medium, so not too bad. Usually it's high, so I will take that. Relatively short lift hill, relatively short drop, but I like this dive over top of the water and kind of the turnaround here. This little dip is a bit awkward, but otherwise it's not too bad. Brake run's a little bit short, but we only have 2 trains, so that doesn't really matter too much. I think we're doing okay there. Ideally, I would have had a larger pathway plaza in here because you kind of like to get into the park and then sort of have a pause, which is why I tend to put a carousel and a plaza at the front of most of my parks. But we really didn't have the space to do that in any kind of a clean way this time, so we're going to have to do without it. But we do have a little plaza over here around this tree that we couldn't move, and our carousel did land right here. This bridge remains as it is. That was one of the original game items, or game pathways here. Let's pick up our looping coaster here in the middle. So this is high, medium as well. Not too bad on the stats. Double loop here, which is where I started really, is the loops, and then I kind of figured this swoopy dive here at the end, and then a couple of hills, and our final dive down here into the tunnel, which just loops around and comes back up with that sort of double up into the brakes. I don't love the tunnel, but it's not too bad of a fit there. It was actually initially Andrew from Mickey Man's RCT station that kind of turned me on to the idea of doing it. And once I realized I could do it, it was one of those things that I kind of felt like I had to do, even if maybe we could have done it perhaps a little bit cleaner, although I'm not quite sure how I would have managed that. But regardless, we go over to this side here, and we've got this loop of path up here where we have the carousel, or not the carousel, the Ferris wheel, and the observation tower, along with the shot tower, the swing ship, and the scrambler. A couple little eateries and a little viewing area here off of the top of the mountain. All that circled around our big wooden coaster here, which was our first one that we put in. So this one is little bit of a more awkward layout than some of the other ones, perhaps. High, very high, medium. That's not totally surprising because we have got a couple of the smaller diving corners here. So there's this guy here, and then there's also these 2 right here, which are taking at kind of some speed. So maybe the forces are a little less great in those. We've got our small little lift hill here, and the thing was I wanted to do this nice big drop and climb over top of the water there, so that's really what kind of informed the rest of this layout. So, really I was kind of building this whole thing around that one element, but it worked out okay. Got a couple of little diagonals in there. There's our nice little dive up onto the mountain one more time, and then down off of it. Yeah, that's probably a little bit fast on those corners, but in the end, it worked out okay, and comes into the brakes with just enough speed, so I think we're in good shape there. We'll go the other direction, and we can see our car ride, which gave us no end to frustration. I'm happy with how it finally ended up. We've got a bit of underground sections there, then up and over the mountainside here, but it's bringing in a lot of people. Usually it seems like the car rides that I do in these scenarios aren't quite long enough, so I guess we checked that box, which is good, and that one works out okay. Now our suspended coaster here, which is high, which is pretty typical for a suspended coaster. And I think this one worked out pretty well. This one was also fairly heavily suggested on by Andrew, and it was a really good idea, kind of the thought of coming up with the lift hill here, having this 270 helix just at the top, nice and slow before we get to the nice big drop over top of the water, kind of that big bad wolf styling there. So here's our big drop, then our a slow climb here into the nice diving turnaround that we had to bring up to get that log flume underneath of it. kind of midsection here right along the ground, which I think is kind of neat. I like that train by train pass right there, which is kind of fun too. And then our final helix there, which I don't really like, if we're being honest. I don't love the straight section there, but in general, it's not too bad, so I can kind of live with it. And it's one of those sort of casualties of not being able to move as much stuff around. Then our log flume right here that kind of goes in and out of the mountainside here before climbing up, kind of having a second run here, up again, and then our final drop right here into the tunnel, and then come back out, back to the station. It's a little bit more than I would maybe have liked over top of the water, but on the whole, not too bad. And if there's anything to go over top of the water, a log flume seems like the most acceptable thing, so we'll be all right with that. Now our last coaster here, we'll pick up this corkscrew coaster here, Arrow Custom Looping Coaster. High, medium, which is not too bad, I don't think, but we're going to do our kind of tribute to Anaconda at King's Dominion here with the color scheme, and then also this idea of the very raised inversions here with the loop, with the Sidewinder, and then the double corkscrew. At this little dip up here at the top end of the hill, I could have potentially shoved a brake run in there, but it's not quite long enough, and the ride itself isn't quite long enough to begin with, so it really just didn't make sense to do that. But we do have our nice little diagonal brake run. Could have been longer, but in general, I think it's okay, and I'm all right with the flat corner here. It kind of feels like almost Tennessee Tornado has a little bit of a yoink to the side there at the very end of the layout. Top spin up here, spiral slide there, also this section of underground pathway, which I wanted to generally avoid, but in this instance, I think it kept this whole area looking relatively clean. I think it is kind of interesting, though, because of the trees, we really couldn't do a good density in this park, because you can't really layer things because you got to keep building around the trees. So there's just not a lot of space in general to fill up in any kind of dense way. I did mention on the time lapse that I considered a junior boomerang from Vekoma, and the idea was it would have sat kind of right around here with a lift going backwards up the hill. I think this is the gap right there maybe, and then it did a couple of things over here, crossed over, and then came back, but it just really didn't fit quite well with the suspended coaster, and in general, I just wasn't a huge fan of the idea, so I let it go, and we are left with our 5 here, which I don't think is too bad of a map. So there we are. The infamous Rainbow Valley has been conquered. This was the one I was most worried about, so I'm happy to get it out of the way. So next up, we have our last of the original game scenarios, number 21, Thunder Rock. Definitely leave a comment here in this video. Tell me which coaster of these 5 you liked the best and what you're looking forward to in the next ones. We will continue on after RCT 1's main scenarios. I get that question a bit on YouTube. We are going to roll into the Corkscrew Follies or Added Attraction scenarios next and then continue on from there. So I will eventually get to all of them. It may be a long time till I get to some of them, but we will get there. But certainly let me know if there's one you're looking forward to in particular. Down below you can find a link to all of our stuff like Twitch if you want to see any of these streams live, or our Discord channel where a lot of this conversation continues. So hope to see you around there. Thank you always for the watching and the support, and like always, we will catch you in the next one. Let's go check out some time lapses, and we will call it a day. Bye now.